around after a while, that's what we do. Just a quick background, pardon? Okay. 1, 2, 3, 4, can you hear me now, Lynn? No? I can't get much closer. Oh, I must be a comedian now. I got the microphone right up to your mouth. Okay, just a quick background on this. Joe Schmidt and I had a discussion based on some information provided by Lori Hip about boxes that were in the basement, and we must go find out about them. My interest in history was such that it piqued my idea of going down and looking, and lo and behold, there are maybe 50, 60 boxes in the basement. Most of them are irrelevant for our purpose, and the ones we wanted were at the bottom. So it was quite a bit of time getting everything out and going through it and then getting it organized. The display that you see out here is the creativity of Joe Schmidt. She did all the work on that, and she did a great job of what's there. The well-deserved. The part of the problem we've run into is records are inconsistent, not unusual in situations like this. There's been no concerted effort to have kind of an archive located here for information that can be done over time. I will talk about that at a later juncture, but at some point we need to establish an archive here to not only document your existence here in time, but going forward and trying to find more information about people who preceded us here. This is going to be a 4-part series, 2 this spring, 2 in the fall. Today is the early years, 1884 to 1930. The reason I chose 1930 is that's really the beginning of the Depression. And from the Depression through World War II, nothing really changed. Everything was the same, the model was the same, whatever they did. And it wasn't a time in which you could venture forth into new buildings or anything like that. It just didn't play out. So I chose 1930 as a stopping point. The buildings, which is next week, I was fascinated finding information about buildings that used to be here, some parts of buildings that are still here, and how it evolved over time, who donated the money, how it was done, and so forth like that. I found it very interesting. The property, the original property for the Milwaukee Protestant home, and I should point out, I'm not going to use the term East Castle because East Castle doesn't start until around 2000. So the Milwaukee Protestant home is the historical term for the organization. The next year will be the lifetime care idea. To me, this is the most fascinating because it's the most complex issue they had to deal with. It was a huge problem going every year trying to figure out how long people are going to live, what's the cost of doing it, where do we find the money, how do we get the money. For many, many years, this organization had to raise donation money to operate the program. It wasn't in the current configuration at all, very different accordingly. And then the last time will be the modern era, which really starts in 1960. There's efforts in the 1950, which we'll cover, but 1960 is the big change. And that's when they build the first apartments. And the first apartments is Bradford Terrace. Okay? And so it starts a whole chain reaction that'll take the next 30 years to change the complexity of this organization. So it's something to consider as we going forward. I gotta find the clicker here, and we should be ready. This is from a presentation last year. This is our neighborhood. This is a Sanborn fire map. This is the Protestant home right here, built at this location. This is Bradford. This is Glen Avenue. It's not Downer Avenue, it's Glen. Okay, that's where it's located. And our property was fairly limited in size. You can't really tell here because there's a street running behind us, which would in essence be somewhere where the historic boiler building is, and we run through the property. So that's the only property that we had when the original building was created. Okay, so that's our neighborhood, and as you can see, Not a lot of people living here. This was the outskirts of the city of Milwaukee. Most of the people who were on the board of directors lived south of us. They lived on Prospect, they lived on Franklin, they lived on places, what we would call the Lower East Side today.
Paul, what year is this approximately?
This map is 1885, okay? It's right they continue to update them, but we'll go from that. Okay, this is our neighborhood, okay? And our neighborhood was originally populated by St. Mary's Hospital. They came here in 1850, right up on the corner where the old building still stands. That was the location of the St. Mary's Hospital. On the corner was St. Rose's Orphanage. Next door, our next door neighbor, was the Wisconsin Industrial School for Girls. Ultimately, would be taken over by the state of Wisconsin and moved to Oregon, Wisconsin. The only odd thing about that, my first job I shouldn't say in college, but when I was in Madison, was working at the Wisconsin State School for Girls. So this is its origin. And we're immediately north of it. So that's the neighborhood when the building is going to be built. Milwaukee Protestant Home for the Aged. The term that was always the problem was the aged. It wasn't a marketing tool, but they stayed with it for a long time. Women lead the way to charity and future changes in the social welfare movement of the 21st century. I cannot overemphasize the fact that historically this organization was a creation of women, and it was no men were on the board till 2003. So you start in 1884 and you go up to 2003, it's all women who run the organization. And they are committed, they are dedicated, and they work. Very different what I would call the modern board, where you have quarterly meetings or semi-annual meetings and you're expected to raise money and that's about it. They did everything. They were visitors. They set up the rooms for people. They went here all the time. They were out soliciting donations for food. They did everything to make the operation work. So it was what you would call a real working board. Okay, City of Milwaukee, 1884. Population of the city is 115,000. By 1890, it would be 204,000. And by 1900, it would be 285,000, becoming the 14th largest city in the U.S. The industrial age was coming to Milwaukee. Corporations like Allen Bradley, Harnisch-Fager, Chain-Belt, Nordberg, Falk were all at national standing. And of course, there was the beer industry of Schwitz, Pabst, and Glatz, and Miller, all making Milwaukee famous. Wealth would begin to accumulate on Yankee Hill, which would be south of us, and that became the wealth of the city. Cleveland defeats Blaine for the president. Two of our well-known presidents, Blaine and Cleveland. This is City Hall. The picture is blurred because the DPI issue is here, but as you see this tall tower here, it's primarily telephone lines running back and forth. Telephone lines were everywhere in the city at that point in time. They weren't out at the Milwaukee Protestant Home. The 1883 is the Newhall House fire. This is a national tragedy in 1883. 70 people die in this fire. It's the largest hotel fire in U.S. history at that point in time. This is the memorial to those people at Forestome Cemetery. They couldn't identify the bodies, so they needed a mass grave for
What was the hotel?
Pardon? It was a hotel, the Newhall House.
Do you know where it was?
Oh yeah, it's on Michigan and Milwaukee, right across the street from the Grain Exchange. That was the location of it. It was a horrific fire, just horrific. People actually were jumping out of the building and getting caught in the electrical lines. Just ugly, ugly. This is the Southside Brewery. Most people don't know about the building. And you'll see the name here is the Philip Best Southside Brewing Company. Philip Best is the son of Jacob Best, who was the founder of that family brewing empire. Philip Best is the father of the wife of who? Captain Pabst. Pabst marries into the business. Pabst knew nothing about beer, folks. He knew how to market, but he didn't know anything about beer. This is their South Side location. This would have been south of Allen Bradley Corporation and was torn down in about 1888 or 1889. They felt they didn't need it anymore for production. Okay, living and working in Milwaukee. Remember, we're talking around 1884 when this organization is going to start. So, average wage for men was $3 to $7 per week. Per week. Okay? Most of us wouldn't go to work for half a day for anything like that. And for women, it was $2 to $3 a week. So it's, in relative terms, it's hard for us to imagine how it could be so limited. But it was really just, labor was cheap. Average lifespan for women was 44.5 years. We've almost doubled that in the modern era. Okay, but 44.5. And the average age for men was 40.7. One of the things that takes the average for men down dramatically is the Civil War. We're still looking at the impact of Civil War on our society. At that point, over 500,000 men died in that situation, so it was dramatically different. Family size was 4.93 units per household. That's basically mom, dad, and 3 kids. That's the basic model that's there. Today, we're down to 1.7 units. I didn't want to get into a long lecture about population, but we're not replacing ourselves. So someone's going to have to replace us. Standard for education, 8th grade was the standard. Every 8th grader went through something called the completer service at 8th grade because you were expected to go to work. You were 13, 14 years of age, you went to work. Very few people went to high school. If you wanted to go to high school, you had to be recommended by your teachers, and then you had to pass an entrance examination. So it was really quite different. Okay, what were the social welfare activities in Milwaukee in the post-Civil War era? I had to research this because I kept coming up with other organizations that were referring people to the Milwaukee Protestant Home. And so I began to look how many organizations existed in Milwaukee at that time. And this is kind of a history run. St. Rose's is 1850. Milwaukee County Poorhouse is 1854. The Home for the Friendless, which was temporary residence, primarily for women, but was the Home for the Friendless. Those were the terminology of the day, folks. Then St. John's Home, 1868, which primarily served priests and their wives. And the reason being is priests were so poorly paid, when they had to retire, they just had no income and no opportunity. So that was the origin of St. John's. And then poor women. The West Side ladies started a home for Civil War veterans in 1868. This is the group of women who raised money to create what we now know as Wood, Wisconsin. They did a marvelous job. It's kind of interesting to read the history of the West Side ladies because it was all women who raised the money, but their husbands wouldn't let them touch the money. They handled all the money for them. And there's a back and forth in stuff that you could read about it, very typical of the age. The Women's Club was 1876. The Women's Exchange, it's 1882, a U.S. movement for self-sufficiency using millinery, baking, and food service to give women jobs. I discovered this because women were coming from the Women's Exchange to the Protestant Home, and their entrance fee was being paid by the Women's Exchange. So that led me to the question, what the heck is the Women's Exchange? I've never heard about it. Started in 1882, essentially a national movement. Milwaukee was one of the places that had it. Chicago, Cleveland, New York, Baltimore all had a Women's Exchange. And what they did is they operated a restaurant, they operated a bakery, and they operated what I'll call a millinery shop, where women could bring in their goods and sell them and get money. It lasted till 1930. I'd never heard about it before, but it was a national movement and it was very interesting. And again, virtually everything that we're talking about here is run by women. Men are not active in what you would call today the social welfare movement. It's all women. And you can't lose sight of that in the whole thing. This is the next group. We're 1884. Then comes the Milwaukee Catholic Home, which is 1906. The Protestant Orphanage, 1903, 1906 is the Protestant Orphanage, which is at the corner of North and Prospect, and operated there until Columbia bought out the property sometime in the late 90s, I guess, sometime into the 90s before it was gone. 1906, the Wisconsin Farm and Home School for Boys. This is one of the first things for boys, or young men at the time. It was also part of what was in those days known as the fresh air movement. And the whole idea was that if you could get kids out of the city and take them out to the country, into the agricultural world, they would grow up and be major problem citizens of the United States. It's called the fresh air movement. It was big throughout the East Coast for years, until maybe the last 15 years, the New York Times used to run the fresh air camp projects, and that was the origin of it. But the whole idea was to get fresh air, be out in the country, and it would make you whole. Two major themes become religious organizations take the lead in concerns about the welfare of abandoned women and children, and women are at the forefront of the development of these many institutions. I indicated earlier about this. You can't ignore the fact that these were all driven by women. It's not driven by men at all, as you read through everything that's there. This is the major financial donor to women's activities, the Protestant Home, you name it, Martha Mitchell is giving money. And she is probably, her husband is the wealthiest person in Wisconsin, and she is giving money. Every time she gives money, the money is given in whose name? His name, okay? And it's one of the problems going through the literature, the documents that we have. Every woman is Mrs. E.J. somebody, and you don't know their first name. You never know their first name. First names do not appear in the board of directors documents until probably the Second World War. At that point, they begin to list their first names, but it's just kind of intriguing. This was their home. Anybody who's familiar with it will know this is no longer here. Well, something is there. The ballroom is up on the second floor. So if you've ever been to Wisconsin Club, the ballroom is on the top up here. But this is a picture of the house. When their daughter got married, they blocked off Wisconsin so the wedding party could walk across from their house to St. James Episcopal Church and have a wedding. It was just fascinating pictures when you see them. This is St. Rose's up the street. This is what it looked like. It's a large building. And this is the Industrial School for Girls. Quite large. And if you pay attention to the architecture, it kind of looks a little bit like what place that we call Milwaukee Protestant Home, okay? It's a consistent architectural element that's there. Unfortunately, the way the picture is done, we're over here in this corner, so we're not part of it, but it was just to do this. By the way, this is from a postcard. A lot of postcards back in the day were ways you could do good pictures of historical places. Okay, how do you start a home for women? Well, it's an interesting way they did it. Mrs. R.W. Patterson, who is a member of Summerfield Methodist Church. Summerfield was originally downtown, a large organization. Then they moved up to Juneau and Cass. Juneau and Cass. The building is currently for sale. If you'd like to buy a church and convert it into condos, you can probably get a good deal on it. That's what happens to urban churches in many cases. And she contacted 20 churches to propose the development of a home for women whose life experiences had left them few options for a dignified place to live. The Milwaukee Poor Farm was not considered a desirable option. The Milwaukee Poor Farm, as it was initially called, was the last stop. You didn't want to end up there. At its peak, it had about 1,600 residents right after the turn of the century, 1900. The first meeting was held at Plymouth Congregational Church. For those of you who are congregational, I know it's United Church of Christ today, but it was Plymouth Congregational Church then. The result of the meeting were 16 women who committed themselves to the development of a home for, and the term always appears, is destitute women. Okay, and the definition isn't there, but it essentially means they're broke, they had no family. Those are the two variables: no money, no family. The second meeting was held a week later, and 34 women attended a meeting to form a corporation called the Milwaukee Protestant Home for the Aged. This meeting led to the renting of one half of a duplex at 710 Van Buren. 1 year later, they rented the entire home for the next 8 years. The early motto of the home was need, not creed. Okay, so they're trying to deal with the issues even within the Protestant group, that they didn't get caught in that trap of one church being pit against another in terms of this kind of thing. So it's need, not creed. This is the Plymouth Church, circa 1880. The building is still there. The roof line here, the conical piece, is gone, but the rest of the building is still there. When Plymouth Church left there and came up to the east side, this became a Scottish Rite facility. It was a Scottish Rite facility forever. It was sold maybe 7-8 years ago. They were going to turn it into either a hotel or condos. Nothing has happened. It's still sitting there. I guess if you like this kind of building, you could probably get a good deal on it. So, but that's it, still there. This is Summerfield Methodist Church. I'm sorry about the blurriness of the picture, but as I blew it up, the DPI issue became an issue, and so it's there. That used to be right downtown. That's where Mrs. Patterson attended. I'm just showing you the pictures of the churches. This is again from a postcard. Okay, it was big in the days to show you your churches, whatever. This is Temple Ben Jeshurun, the Jewish church. This is Jesu, Catholic Church. This is St. Paul's Episcopal. This is the Plymouth Church we just talked about, and this is Manual Presbyterian. Probably the largest churches in Milwaukee at the time. There's one postcard, and I wish I had made a copy of it. They compare the height of the steeples to see who's got the biggest steeple at the time. It's just amazing. That's there. But they would all participate in some way or another. When you would say, well, why was Temple Ben Jeshurun Emmanuel participating? They were donors as individuals, members of that congregation, were on the donor list many times, and they were there. Even the bishop of the Catholic Church back in those days, I believe was Bishop Henney, is on the donation list for $25. So it was interesting. The organization needed rules and guidelines. If you look at the books that are outside here that Joe has displayed, you'll find that rules and regulations are extremely important to the organization. The rules of how they operated, what the board did, how you had to behave if you were, quote, an inmate at the facility. And that was it. While not explicitly stated, the church connection allowed for the major donations and the ability to open in October 23rd of 1884. In a matter of a month, they rented a building, got the money, got in to operate it. So they had to have a source of income, and that was probably donations from the churches. It's not documented, but I think it's a reasonable assumption for this. Admission was a major issue. Who should be admitted? Status to qualify, women only, and that was the original goal, women only. It did not last, but it was women only when they started. Should there be an entrance fee, and a multitude of questions that would gradually become solved on a trial and error basis over the years in terms of how they operated. This is the house on Van Buren. These are later shots. The early ones that they use around here, they show trees and all that kind of stuff. The trees are all gone in these pictures, so you can just get a natural look at it. These are probably pictures from the 1920s, maybe 1930s at the latest. I'll just move on from, I'm sorry. And this is the current location of that house. That house is right here. This is St. Rita's. So if you know where St. Rita's is, that's the location of the house. So I took the picture so it would show you the house next door, and this is St. Rita's, but that's the location. The address used to be 710, it's now 1620. City of Milwaukee went through two major changes in addresses over the years. This is the 1926 iteration of addresses. And the names that frequently appear in the minutes and documents are as follows: Mrs. G.A. Dutcher, Mrs. D.W. Fowler, Mrs. H.W. Patterson, one of the major founders, and Mrs. E.J. Lindsay. Okay, their name keeps coming up and up and up. They were stalwarts of the organization. They were presidents, they were treasurers, they did all those things over the years. Mrs. Lindsay would become the longest of them, almost 50 years of dedication to the Milwaukee Protestant home. Really quite extraordinary. And here we go. This is the board of directors. This picture is from the 1920s. You can see the style, whatever style you call it. And this is Mrs. Lindsay. She's right here with the scroll in her hand. And as you can tell, it's not a smiling group. And they just don't have smiles on their face. It's there. Now, Mrs. Lindsay, if you would look through the records, particularly in terms of donations, came from a larger Lindsay family. And they were the Lindsay Agricultural Equipment Company, and this was their business. The building is still there. It's on 2nd Street. Let me see. If you're on 2nd and you cross the railroad track going south, okay, so the post office is on your right. The building that you'll come up to at that point is the Lindsay building. This is the first one, and this is the addition to it. They were the largest supplier of agricultural equipment in the Midwest between basically the late 1870s till about 1920. What did them in was the modern tractor. They never got into tractor sales. And so the equipment that they were providing were primarily for horses to pull in the fields, so for all that kind of stuff. But this location was perfect for them because right behind the building is a railroad track. And they did everything by catalog. An early catalog company, farmers throughout the Midwest would buy equipment from them, and that was the source of their income, the source of their money. Okay, admissions, who and why? Initially, admissions were limited to women who had an age range 65 or older. Now, it's kind of interesting, it's 1884, and they established 65. When Social Security is developed in 1938, what's the age they use? 65. I have no idea how in 1884 they had a prescience to predict what the Social Security age would be. But that was it. Now you should know only 5.65% of the female population lived to that age in 1880. So you were serving a small percentage of the population at that time, but it was still significant to do. Originally you had to be residents of the city of Milwaukee. That lasted for a couple of weeks, so to speak. And they realized if they were going to raise money, they were going to be doing it in Milwaukee County. So they finally admitted people from Milwaukee County. It took them about 8 or 9 years to allow admissions from places outside of Milwaukee County. And it was always a serious consideration of why they would take a person in from another area, but that they had to work that out. Exactly how to determine eligibility was a continuing challenge. It appears that many of the early admissions were people whose church recommended them, and in many instances paid the $100 fee for them to get in. it's pretty clear that in the early admissions, the fee to get in was being paid for by someone else, either the church, the family, friends, whatever. They were paying the fee to get in. These people did not have the money to put up $100 to get in to the Milwaukee Protestant home, which tells you something about the nature of the persons that they are serving at that point. They have limited financial ability. Many of them are described as destitute. That's the word that keeps popping up about it. Those who could not pay the entry fee were referred to Milwaukee County Poorhouse, and it's where you did not want to go. But there were a number of referrals to the poorhouse when the person could not qualify to get in. Now, qualifying to get in is a complex issue in terms of how it operates and who's going to implement it. And we'll talk about that a little bit. Come on, Joe, sorry, hit the wrong one. Go back, come on. Down is not working. There we go. Here's the Milwaukee County Poorhouse. This is the last place you wanted to go. It was part of the motivation for the original women who got together to create a place that would be different than the Milwaukee County Poorhouse.
Where was that?
Out county grounds. A lot of these buildings existed well into the 1900s. When I came to Milwaukee in 1970, there were a couple of these buildings still in use at that time. This is an idyllic picture, by the way. Again, another postcard. This is the first admission. This is Elizabeth Thomas. She's the first person to be admitted. She is the person who gets the newspaper write-up of a person who's struggling to survive in Milwaukee, has no options, has no family, and so forth. So this is all the initial contracts were handwritten. Examples are out on the table outside so you can see them. This is the first one. As you can see, Elizabeth signed her name with an X. She could not write her own name. Would not have been unusual at that point in time for people to use an X to sign their name. It tells you something. This is interesting. In the early, maybe year and a half, all of these statements had to go through a notary public and be validated that you signed that agreement and you agreed to what was in it. This is Mr. Rogers. By the way, Mrs. Rogers is on the board many years. He's attorney in Milwaukee, and he's also a notary public. In 1890, the board purchased 2 lots at 1620 20th Street for our future home. Okay, I went to find 1620 20th Street. This is an area that had been urban renewal, probably in the late 60s, early 70s. It would be about 4 blocks north of Marquette University. And when I got there, it's an empty lot. So, nothing to take a picture of, unfortunately, nothing there. However, you must consider the fact that where they had located, how it would change the complexity of the organization and what happened over time. And that came to an end when the city of Milwaukee offered them the current property that we are on, and it was for free. The city had claimed the property for tax purposes and was willing to donate it as long as it was done for charity purposes. To fund the new building, the board engaged in a 2-year fundraising effort. And by the way, fundraising never stops. It's there every year. You see efforts to do it. That touched just about anybody with money in Milwaukee, raising $23,000 to pay for the new building that opened in 1892. Sorry, it's 1893 should be the number there. The original building is part of what we call the castle today. Come on, we don't want that one. There we go, this is the one. So this is first page of the donations, okay? This is almost 7 pages long donations, and they're all these kind of things. These are the big hitters. Alexander Mitchell, John Plankinton, the Bethel Home Fund, that was a Lutheran group. Guido Pfister, who coughed up $2,500. Joseph Colby Abbott Building downtown that people may know about. He was in the railroad business. Cook and Hine is a law firm in Milwaukee. Stephen Clement, I haven't found out who Stephen is, but he coughed up $1,000. So did Lydia Gardner. Rare to find a woman's name used as part of a donation. The 10-cent screen aggregate, anybody know what the 10-cent scheme is? It's akin to if you go to the brewery games, they come around and you can split the pot. It's a fundraising thing. So you buy a ticket and someone's going to get half the pot, whatever the pot is. And so they were able to donate money. Angus Smith, probably the largest grain dealer in Milwaukee at the time. His house is right over here on Terrace. It's still there. It's now what's the congregation that's got a church over there in the big house? Seventh-day Adventist, that's it. That's his house. The Brewers Association, which is the brewery piece of Marshall and Elsley Bank, proceeds of the fair of 1889. There were annual fairs, and the fairs were selling whatever they could have people donate, and they would have a fair and people would come to do it. And here she is, E.J. Lindsay. It doesn't say Mrs., it says E.J. E.J. is her husband. $200, Dr. Sen, Captain Pabst, and it just goes on. These are the names in Milwaukee where people had money. Now the donations of $1,000 back then is well over $100,000 in today's market. So it's a lot of money that's being donated. Okay. And this is a building that they built. We recognize the front face. As you see it going back, you really can't see much of this anymore. The building was stucco, it was not brick. The only thing that was brick was the facing on the side. It's actually larger stone. And it was stucco all the way. When they put on the Hinton edition, they bricked it up to match the whole organization, so to speak. But done in that fashion. 50 women lived in this building. That each had a room, okay? Not an apartment, a room. If the room was bigger than 8 by 10, you were lucky, okay? It was a small space, but it was your life. You lived in the room. I don't want that one. Standards for admission in 18, this is the document that you had to sign, okay? This is important to get in. I understand and consent and agree that my admission to the home is because its proper authorities, the board, so far as they know me and are acquainted with my disposition, okay, and that basically they're telling you they're worried about their personality. Are they going to be amenable to the situation? Habits and character that are worthy of care, okay. I acquire no right, not subject to their discretion, which is an interesting phrase, which means if you want to do something, we have to approve it. Whatever it is, we have to approve it. And they were very strict about that early on. Be subject, obey each and every rule and regulation. Okay? There's structure to this on your behavior. I cheerfully and without question shall and will at all times render such aid and assistance in the necessary work of the home as the matron shall require of me. If you were physically able, you were asked to help in the cleaning or set up rooms or so forth throughout the organization. If you physically weren't able, they didn't ask you to do that. But if you were physically able, you had to participate in the care of everything. And they shall have the right to expel me. They did expel people, you should understand that. Primarily because of lack of cooperative behavior. That what became the issue. When you have 50 people living in close quarters, you have to behave. Otherwise, you have a problem. As the admission committee evolved, and it took years for them to come up with good standards on how they wanted to admit people, potentially needed to declare a full financial disclosure. This meant everything. So when you came in, you turned over all your life's assets, and it better be all. If you lied on the document, if you tried to squirrel away money for your children or your grandchildren, that was not allowed, and they would deny you admission because you lied. And it was not tolerated, and people just could not get in because they were trying to hide their assets. Now, in the modern era, you hire a lawyer to hide your assets. Back then, this was not tolerated. They did not want to have that happen. So every nickel and dime that you might have now became the property of the Milwaukee Protestant home. Just think about having to give up all your money. It's pretty hard to do. Okay. They visited your living arrangement, and it was conducted by 2 members of the committee. It's a standing committee of the board. They assessed your cleanliness, assets such as furniture and other objects that might have monetary value. When they looked at your furniture, they were interested in 2 things. Could it be used at the Protestant home, i.e. in a room, setting up a room, or filling in space in the parlors, etc. So they were looking at the furniture, and then they looked at what they could sell. Okay, it was kind of an interesting way of doing it. And then, assessing your cleanliness, assets such as furniture and other objects that might have monetary. Until World War I, you were expected to furnish your own room. Remember, when they started, they had nothing, so they needed to find furniture. And they got a lot of donations for furniture, but they still continually needed more furniture to operate it. Were your social skills such that you might be an asset to the home? That was a question that the admission committee had to address. That the person had the social skills to join the team. The idea of a concept of life care was not clearly defined. And then the last one, you can barely see it the way it's set up here. Could you pass the stair test? To be admitted, no elevator. You had to be able to walk 4 flights of stairs. If you could not, they could not admit you. Now, if we applied that standard today, what would happen? So therefore, thank God for elevators. And those of us who live in contemporary and battle C elevator every day and complain about it, be thankful for it, otherwise it's the stairs. But this was a critical issue for them. You had to be able to get up and down. As people aged or had health problems, to solve the stair problems, they would move them to the first floor. And if your room was on the first floor, you would have to move somewhere else. So there's a constant moving of people who are in the building. This is directly out of the book. Section V, inmates. Now, the term inmates, went back and dug out the 1890 version of the Webster Dictionary, and the term inmate meant someone who lives with someone else. So it was an acceptable term in those days, but as terminology evolves in terms of ethology of words and what happens by First World War, it begins to refer to prison inmates. That becomes the term. They're living with each other, the same thing, but it's a very different tone to it and expectation for it. So here goes. And if you've followed a lot of English literature in the late 1800s, so forth, the phraseology here will ring a bell. The inmate shall be required at all times to observe the rules and regulations of the home in every respect. They shall endeavor by a quiet and genteel deportment to diffuse cheerfulness and good feeling throughout the home, and by acts of kindness and forbearance to gain the esteem and promote the comfort and happiness of each other. Now, the phrasing of this is clearly out of date. However, the intent is pretty good. And when you read through it, if you get through the language there, the intent is pretty good. Worship shall be observed on a regular basis, and every inmate is punctually expected to attend. Services were held every Sunday. The only exception for you is if you went to a church on the outside, you were excused from church here, okay? The way they did church here was every Sunday there was a different Protestant minister who did the service for them. And it's a practice they continued well into late 70s, early 1980s. So there was always a rotating minister every week to do that.
See, Paul,
Yes.
if they're destitute women and they were Jewish or Catholic or atheists,
Jewish and Catholic were not
okay.
in. They had their
Because
own,
they said we-
well, for want of a better term, they had their own organizations to go to. I mean, you have to understand the religious kind of practices and how people operated in those times. This was the Protestant home, so you had to be, now, I'm sure there were people who admitted who had no church, okay? But if you were a Catholic, you were expected to go to Catholic charities. If you were Jewish, you went to Jewish charities, okay? And that was the standard practice.
Didn't they say need not greed?
Well, they were talking about Protestants, you know, they were keeping the Lutherans out. How's that? Because, you know, the Lutherans would ultimately form their own homes. They actually had two of them. One was synod and the other is the other synod. It's just, what are you going to do?
So it was not, there were no Lutherans included?
Yeah.
Well, they were, but they had their own facilities later on, so they went to the Lutheran home. Religious, how do I characterize this? Religion played an extraordinary role in the concept of welfare before the government got into the business of doing that. You had no options. There was no government welfare program for you in 1884. There was no office to go to except to go to the office for the poorhouse and get admitted to the county. There was just really nothing. You see certain elements of rise during the 1930s, but our concept of welfare today, the concept of welfare back then is quite different. Inmates are required of those who are able to keep their rooms in proper order. Okay, keep your room in proper order. All cases of sickness among inmates of the home shall be attended to by the physician recommended by the board. This became an issue of whether you could have a private doctor, your own doctor, or whether you had to have the doctor employed by the home. And at one time, they did employ a full-time physician. If you were admitted, you had to go through a physical exam by the Protestant home physician. You couldn't bring in a document from an outside doctor. To be honest with you, they didn't trust the outside documents. They thought there was fudging going on, so they had their own physician. I mean, they were tough about these things. Home shall be not responsible for any debt contracted by any inmate. It's just a simple statement, but periodically people would get into debt and then the home would not be responsible for it. And they would say, well, under life care, you have to take care of me. And they would, no, we're not going to do that. All inmates shall attend the general table and shall endeavor to be present when the blessing is asked. This is a big deal. It comes up many times. You had to get in there before the prayers were said. If you came later, it was considered to be gauche. Not a thing to do, but that was the standard practice at the time. Shall attend the general table. You were assigned to a table, and you ate with the same people, breakfast, lunch, and dinner. I would struggle with that today, but that was the standard practice at the time. So, food and dishes must not be taken to or from the dining room, and no dishes or silver except napkin rings. If someone could explain this to me, I would be happy to understand it. But why the napkin rings? I don't get it. Belonging to the members of the home will be allowed on the tables. So obviously people were taking stuff upstairs, which would not be unusual, whether today or then. Men and women, members of the home, must exchange calls only in the parlor of the home. Now, essentially this meant that if a man wanted to talk to a woman, and she was in her apartment or in her room, they had to adjourn and go down to the parlor and sit and talk. Men were not allowed into the women's room. There was no rule that said women couldn't go into the men's room, but there was definitely a rule that men could not go into the women's room. And that was something that they were really, really concerned about. It was, Life care concepts developed by 1910. Since the term inmates was, I explained that one, so we don't have to go through it again. The admission fee by 1900 is now $500. In 1900, $500 was a lot of money. So who was being admitted? People who had some resources, particularly family resources that could support them, etc. By the way, one of the questions they always ask is, why doesn't your family take care of you? Because the expectation in those days was that as you got older, the family would take care of you. The bigger issue was if you didn't have a family, who would take care of you? But if you had family and they felt the family could take care of you, they would deny you admission because you had family, had resources that could take care of you. The new section in the rules is the property of inmates to be conveyed to the home. The home shall have the right to sell and convert any such property to money. This provision would ultimately apply to pensions and the like. So if you had a pension, not many people did in those days, the pension came to the home. When Social Security started in 1938, there was a long discussion of who should get the check. Protestant home wanted the check and sent to them. The Social Security Administration said no, it's going to the person. So the person then had to sign over their check to the Protestant home. And the deal that they struck is the Protestant home got 80% of the value of the check, and the individual got 20% of the value of the check. And that's how people began to have their own personal accounts of monies that they could spend. It was done in that fashion. One byproduct of this stage of life care was the home had taken ownership of anywhere from 15 to 24 homes in the Milwaukee area. They used them as rentals because it was income. So it was a source of income for the organizations. They owned the homes. Protestant home became the owner of the house. And at various times when they needed more money, they would sell a house. It was kind of a bank account for them, or a savings account, so that they could get the revenue from it. They literally hired a real estate agent to do the work for them, because it would have been too much for them to do themselves.
So you're not destitute anymore if you have to pay $500?
Well, that's the question, who was paying the $500? We were still having issues of outside organizations supplying money, particularly churches, so someone could get in.
Okay.
But they felt how do I characterize this? Every other year they got into raising the entry fee.
Thank you.
Living conditions, 1893 in the new home. The home was built to provide occupancy for 50 people. Dining room was on the first floor, common area on each floor, and yes, bathrooms were down the hall. Okay? And for those of you who lived in college dorms for a while, that's kind of like dorm living in terms of everything was down the hall, so to speak. In the early years at Lake and Elm, there was no running water in the rooms, only a pitcher and a bowl. No running water in your rooms. How long would it take to get running water in your rooms? Take a guess. Shoot any number. 1938.
Oh, wow.
Pitcher and basin until 1938. Whoa. Whoa. You had to go down the hall for a bath. You had to go down the hall for the bathroom. It was quite a deal. Rooms were furnished by inmates. It appears that the standard furnishings were a metal bed, chair, dresser, small table, and a lamp. Early couples admitted were placed in separate rooms due to the small size of the room. So once they started admitting couples, they were in separate rooms. They weren't next door to each other or anything like that. They were in separate rooms. They did not have enough space to put two people in a room.
Do they have to go downstairs to communicate?
The answer is yes. Yeah, they couldn't go in. Not quite true. I did the assigned seating. Okay, the board created a committee to direct various operations. There was the executive committee. These are the people who ran it. It was 8 people. They were the decision makers. Everybody else reported into them. And it was kind of interesting. Every expenditure came to them. If the expenditure was a dollar, they approved it. Okay, admissions committee, we discussed some of that. Visiting committee, if you were on the visiting committee, you would be here 1 to 3 days a week visiting people in their rooms or in the parlor area, depending. But the whole idea was to have someone come and visit you, because many of them had no family coming to visit them, spending time with them. Supply committee, oh boy, this was a tough one. They would literally go to wholesalers and ask for food. And when I say they would ask for food, they would ask for a barrel of flour, bushels of apples, whatever they could get would be donated accordingly, and it became part of their kind of their life stream. Finance committee, raising money all the time. And let's see, the original building cost $32,000. They ultimately raised $28,000. They signed the contract when they had $23,000, and but they had $4,000 in debt. And boy, were they worried about the debt. $4,000 in debt. Where are we going to get the money? They raised it. They did it. Advisory committee. This is the interesting one. Shortly after the start of the organization, it was evident that some advice might be needed, and a non-voting committee of 4 men and 2 women was created to deal with building maintenance, which was always a big issue, as well as investment strategies. Early on, they did not have money to invest, but later on they would establish an endowment. That endowment by 1926 was $400,000. An extraordinary amount of money that they raised for their endowment. So they had stock of everything. They had bonds everywhere. They had them all listed out, and when the payments are coming due and how much would be coming in each month. They were, there's an audit committee and a home furnishing committee. Okay. This is a bedroom. It's 2 people in here, and as you can see, it's just dresser, chair, another chair, table. This is it. Unfortunately, I don't have a picture of the full room, but generally what I understand is the bed was against a wall. It wasn't a freestanding where you could have 2 sides to the bed. It was only one side. It was against a wall, and that would be it.
So who let the guy in the room?
Well, that's a good question. This is probably a later picture, probably sometime after World War I, somewhere in that particular time. It gives you an idea of what life was like. This is my favorite picture of all that we encountered. It's the original one is outside on display. This is a group of young women who I believe are in the backyard of the house on Van Buren. And I believe these are volunteers who are being thanked with a tea in the backyard. And it's probably sometime in the late 1880s, maybe very early 1890s, but as you can see, the setting here is just quite extraordinary. It's just a wonderful picture of that point in time. This is Supply Committee 1897. this is, I won't go through expenditures, but this is what they used, okay? They would, at the end of the year, total it all up, this is what they used. 38 barrels of wheat. They baked all their own bread for about 30 years. I could tell when they stopped baking bread because they were no longer buying yeast. The yeast disappeared out of their purchases. Grain, 3 barrels. Flour, 1 barrel. Cracked wheat, 75 pounds. Cornmeal. So you get an idea of what they're eating. Baking soda, baking powder, spice, etc. Over there. Over here on the other side, 418 pounds of crackers. That's a lot of crackers, so. But I guess it went with the soup. Cornstarch, sugar, molasses. Sugar, 3,816 pounds. They must have all had sugar highs. That's an incredible amount of sugar. Cheese, 50 pounds. Milk, 1,990 gallons. Butter, 1,900 pounds of butter. Everything's better with butter, right? Yeah, I got it. Dried apples, dried peaches. You get an idea of what their food was like, and it was very basic. Bread, some vegetables, some fruit. That would be it. What you don't see a lot in this is meat.
They have meat on the top.
I know, but it's compared to everything else that's there.
Didn't it say they only gave them meat at lunch?
Pardon?
Didn't I see it?
Yeah.
Fresh meats are furnished daily for the noonday meal.
For the New Day meal. By the way they did this, the bread was all stacked up on a tray. They came around to your room, or your table, and then you took off the bread, and then they came with the cold meat, and you put that on the bread. You made your own sandwich for lunch. They didn't make it for you. They didn't have table service. You just basically made your own.
Paul, do you have any idea how these records were printed? They're obviously typeset and everything else.
For many years, their annual report was typeset. Remember, they were raising money, and so when they went to donors, they could give them an annual report that was quality as opposed to that. So they were done in that fashion.
You think they were having it done?
Oh, sure. I'm going to guess much of it was donated.
There are examples out on the table.
Yeah, there's examples out on the table. Those annual reports were fundraisers for them. Has anybody seen an annual report for East Castle in the last 10 years? Don't see them anymore. Not doing that kind of fundraising anymore. So. This is the report of the treasurer, just to give you some idea of what they did. This is 1888. So it's just basic idea. $17,000 a year is basically their whole total operating. Entrance fee, challenging it. 1930 it was $1,500. As I said, they keep raising the money, and it'll go up significantly. Who pays the entrance fee? This became a big concern because if an outside party was paying the entrance fee, it meant that the person had limited resources, whereas an individual who could pay the entrance fee had some resources that they were bringing to the Protestant home. And as I said, they claimed all your resources, so they were looking for more than just an entrance fee. Okay, that became.
Once you paid the entrance fee, then were there monthly fees?
Pardon?
Once you paid the entrance fee, were there monthly fees? For the
No.
food? Nothing.
No, there's no monthly fee. Now, after a while, when they collected your pension check, they would get money, those kind of things, but there was no monthly charge as we know it today. The model is completely different. Now, let's put it this way. If you go look in the records, there's purchases at Gimbel's, Schuster's, and Chapman's. They bought your clothes. You did not buy your own clothes. And you wore what you got. All right. Today, no one thinks of that, but that was the standard practice at the time. Carol?
When they donated, when they got property, for example, would that count as an entrance fee or?
No. Yes, you could count the entrance fee if you had excess assets. You could do that, right? was $500. But they were looking for people who had assets. If you didn't have any assets, the amount of money that they needed to raise continually. So they had all kinds of fundraisers. For a number of years, they would find an empty store on Wisconsin Avenue, and they would have a Friday night and Saturday night dinner. And people would come to the dinner, have dinner there, they would raise money. And the women on the board would do all the cooking, all the serving. They were gathering up dishes from everybody's house, so they had enough dishes to feed the people. It was, who has these dishes? And who do they belong to? They're trying to figure out all those kind of things in just organization. So it was a remarkable effort, and they should be more than rewarded for what they did. It was just a ton of work. Who pays for health care? Oh boy, that when I talk about life care in the fall, this is a big issue, just a big issue. How do you do it? So let me ask you this: what hospital they use if St. Mary's was right next door and Columbia was 7 blocks away?
Lutheran on Wisconsin Avenue, way up there.
Virtually everybody went to Columbia. Why? It was the Protestant hospital. People don't understand that. Historically, you had the Catholic hospital. Well, when the Protestants were going to St. Mary's, they were uncomfortable because there were crosses in the room or whatever it was. All that kind of stuff that went on. So that's Columbia Hospital. That was the Protestant hospital. That was the Catholic hospital. Rarely did anybody go to St. Mary's.
You see, the entrance fee in 1930 was $1,500. It's at the period of the Depression. Do you think that there were a lot fewer people able to come up with the $1,500, and did that affect the organization?
That's a good question. What we don't have is good records on admissions and deaths. We have some deaths, so forth, but it's just not a good record on it. Again, it's the record keeping that takes place. Sometimes it's residents who are reporting that people have passed away, as opposed to the organization keeping a record of that. So I can't answer that, but it's a good question. And who could be admitted and who could not? It's a constant struggle with that. If you're admitted, could you keep your bank account? The answer was no. You could have a small account and they would allocate money to you, but you could not have your own bank account. You could not have checking account never appears in the discussion. It's always your savings account. There's no discussion of checking account at any time. If you had no assets, who bought your clothes? They did. They bought your clothes, they bought your shoes, they bought your underwear. They bought just about everything for you. So when they said life care, it was life care. They were taking care of you. And you may not have been happy with what they bought, but that was the deal. And they used to reimburse the staff for trolley money to go down to Gimbel's and buy something at Gimbel's, and they got a nickel for going and a nickel for coming back. They got reimbursed for it. And they kept a record of that.
Excuse me, did they ever consider having their own cemetery?
No. The first 32 graves were donated by Forest Home. There are approximately 65 to 85 people. I haven't done the number, but I've got all their plot things. They're all buried there. This became a big issue. When you entered, they asked you whether you had made your funeral arrangements. They wanted that prepaid, so they didn't have to pay it. To show you how tight they got with money, if you were from Monroe, Wisconsin, and you passed away, Life Care would pay for your casket. They'd pay for it being transported to the railroad station, put on the railroad train, and taken off at the train station in Monroe. But they would not pay for the casket to go from Monroe to the cemetery in Monroe. That was somebody else had to pay that. They were cutting costs on everything went forward. And so it's kind of that. Barbara?
Was there any use on the property for growing your own food or keeping
Yes, that came when the property expanded in 1923. They made a purchase that expanded the property halfway to Prospect, not all the way. Took years to get all the property together. If I mentioned this to Dave Woodard earlier, I said, if they made a big mistake over the years, when the industrial school for girls closed in 1938, they bought 125 feet further south of the south building that we have here. We'll discuss that in more detail with the buildings next week. They could have bought more property. And had they bought more property, this would be a different place today, because they would have the land to expand in very different ways. Just, the footprint is small in terms of what's there. Okay, next week, history of buildings and how we got to our first physical layout. How we are today and what we used to look like and how the property changed over the years, what buildings were here, what buildings were torn down, and buildings you've never heard of. There are a few of those. And one building that most of you don't know that it's there, but it's there. You just have to look for it, but you just don't see it. You just don't think it's part of the existing structure. Any quick questions that you have at this time?
Well, at the end of the day, these inmates who are supposed to be good tempered just to stay around, do you have an impression as to how happy or how safe they felt, or did they feel like this was a better thing than not being here?
My impression from what I've read, and Joe might want to comment on this, is that people were, satisfied to have a place that offered them security. Not having food, not having a place, it's kind of like the whole homeless issue. They were very satisfied with that. Were there complaints? Obviously. I mean, whether it be 1884 or 2025, someone's got a complaint. But they were very autocratic, particularly through World War II. Things lightened up pretty dramatically after that. But they had a tight rein on everything to make it work. It's a remarkable effort that they did. I mean, do not make light of what some of the things that they did. They were trying to build something that no one else was doing at that time and sustaining it. I mean, it's 141 years later, and it's still here, it's still going. A little different model, but the idea is to have a safe, secure place.
Oh.
Go ahead, Carolyn.
I'm amazed at the information that you have from the 1800s. Was there a spokesperson down, how did you get all this knowledge?
Read a lot of minutes, board meetings, all this kind of stuff to get through it. I wish there was more documentation. You have a more complete picture. It's one of the things with this kind of historical research. There's not a consistent saving of information, and without that, you can't. You have to make assumptions, which is not a good thing if you're delving in history. You try to be as factual as you can. The biggest thing that I'm really missing is pictures. Remember the Kodak camera was late 1800s, and it doesn't become popular until after the First World War. So pictures aren't there. And in the modern age, we don't have pictures either. They're all on our phones, and they're not printed out. They can't be transmitted. I'm not leaving my phone to the East Castle for the archives. It's just not going to happen. Who else had it?
I was just gonna ask, when you were looking through all this stuff, did you see anything about any involvement with suffrage efforts?
I did not see that. I would venture a guess that some of the people who were on the board were involved with suffrage, but that's not reported in these documents.
Okay.
So I don't know. And the board, by the way, moves from Yankee Hill, essentially downtown, up Prospect Avenue. And eventually, you look at all the addresses there, Terrace, Wall, all those kind of places. It becomes, middle-class women who had access to money and time to be able to do it. Had they had worked full-time, this would have never occurred. But it was something to do, rather than sitting at home. This was an activity, this was a charity, it was commitment from your church, your social obligations, so to speak, those are important.
Paul, how long have you been working on this project?
We started fall. The interesting thing, Tyler went down the basement with us and started moving all the boxes. Because there were way too many boxes for me to move. Just a lot of stuff. A lot of stuff in the basement that is useless. But it's okay. Any other questions? Otherwise, have a good evening and thank you.